All right. I'm gonna move this over a bit so our screen.
Or do you want me to, did you want me to move the screen behind you over a little bit? Or
Um, yeah,
okay, I'll
that's
get
fine. I think it's fine.
oh, okay.
Okay. Welcome. Today we're gonna go over the SPRP, which is the seller's purchase of replacement property. Well, the last couple of weeks we did a two-part residential listing agreement class. And this kind of goes along with it because you're going to need this form if your seller needs to find a replacement property in order to sell their property. Here's this for you, Anna. I can print some more off in a second too. Okay, so what is this form? Well, if you think about you have a listing and the seller wants to sell, but they don't necessarily have a place to go yet. And they realize I actually don't want to let go of my house and be homeless. So I need a contingency in place that will let me back out of selling my house if I can't find a replacement property. As we know, in the purchase agreement, the law is very heavy toward buyer rights instead of seller rights, and there are not a lot of ways to get out of selling your house as a seller. The buyer has to mess up, or you have to, really have a reason why you cannot sell anymore legally. So in this case, they've come up with this seller replacement property form, which is a contingency for the seller to be able to get out if they cannot find a place to move. Okay. So you were going to put this in your MLS in your agent remarks that the SPRP needs to be part of the purchase agreement. You need to let the potential buyer agent know that your seller needs this document. If you receive an offer and it does not have this attached to it, you're going to have to counter offer and put this document in there. Okay? And double check all that to make sure you're protecting your seller. This is seller protection. It even says it in this document. Okay, so at the top, this is an addendum to the purchase agreement. That's the standard. Or you would check the box if it's with the counter offer. So if they did not put it in the offer when they wrote the offer for you, or if you're on the buyer side and you see that the listing needs to have this document in place, you're going to attach it to your offer. Okay? Again, you put the date, you put the address, the buyer name, and the seller name. Buyer and seller are referred to as the parties. Seller purchase of replacement property. Okay, there's two sections to this. All right, the first one is the contingency for finding a replacement property. The agreement is contingent on seller entering into a contract to acquire replacement property or identifying a suitable property to move to. Okay, that's important because it doesn't necessarily have to be purchasing a new home. They could find a rental, right? So if they couldn't find their dream home yet, but they still want to go ahead and sell, so maybe they're in a better position of not having to have their purchase be contingent, they want the cash in their pocket, they're able to identify a rental to move into. But if the rental market is crazy or they can't find something, if they have three dogs, like they might not be able to find one. And so they still want this contingency in place. So it's letting you basically stating they can find a house to get into contract on and buy, or a rental property, or somewhere else to move. Okay. Seller shall have 17 days to do this. That's the standard. You'll notice that there is a line right there where you can make that different. Depending on what's happening in the market, you can extend that if you think it's going to take them longer. If the market allows that for a buyer would be willing to accept that, we don't know. That just depends on the market at that time. Or if they kind of already have it in mind and they know, you can just shorten that to 5 days or whatever, depending on your situation. Okay, so that amount of days after acceptance they have to remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel the agreement. Okay, so you have the seller, you get into contract, this is in place, they have the 17 days, they're out and they're looking, and let's say they find the house and they write an offer on it and it gets accepted. Okay, then you would go back and you would remove this contingency. You would use the seller contingency removal form and send that over to the buyer agent, letting them know that the finding the replacement property has been removed. Okay, there's two of them though in this form. And it also states not only do you need to remove that contingency, you need to provide proof. So the proof is either a copy of the contract for purchase of replacement property or the contact information and the contact information for escrow or a signed lease or rental agreement. Okay, so you also have to prove that you found a place. Okay, so there's two things. You have to remove that contingency and provide proof to the buyer's agent. Any questions on that? No, if you cannot, within that 17 days or whatever, how many days you put in that line right there, find a house, the seller gets to cancel. You could also ask for an extension, whatever, it just depends on your situation again, but that's their right to cancel. Because again, if this was just a normal escrow without this form, they would not be able to cancel it. Okay. Any questions on that part? Nope. All right. Okay. If seller does not remove the finding replacement property contingency in writing within that time, buyer, after first giving a notice to seller to perform on the car form NSP, may cancel the agreement in writing. Okay, so it doesn't automatically happen on day 17. Just like other contingencies in the purchase agreement, you have to give a notice to perform. Just like there's a notice of buyer to perform, there's also a notice for seller to perform. And so if the buyer wanted them to force them to remove that or cancel, they need to give them the notice to seller to perform. Okay? All right. Or B, seller has entered into a contract to acquire replacement property and finding replacement property contingency is removed. Escrow holder blank, escrow number blank. So B, if you've already found the property that they want to move to, you wouldn't even need to have the finding replacement property section. You would just need the number, the second part of this. So you would check that box that it's not contingent on finding the property, and then you would put the escrow information in there to prove that they have a place to go. Okay, and C, if checked. So notice this doesn't have to be part of it, but it can be, and this is a seller protection. Close of replacement property. The agreement is contingent on seller's ability to close escrow on replacement property according to that contract. This is a contingency in favor of the seller. Seller, by the scheduled close of escrow date for the replacement property, shall either close escrow or remove this contingency in writing. So I want to point out that first sentence where it says the agreement is contingent on seller's ability to close escrow. Okay, how many sellers can go ahead and close escrow without getting the money from their house that they're selling? Not very many. So how can they remove a close of escrow contingency without closing on the first house first, right? So that's why it's pointing out that the contingency is in favor of the seller, because really they kind of keep this in up until like the very last second. Any questions or comments on that part?
When can the buyer say, "Free, I don't want to wait, can they cancel?"
Well, it goes into way more depth here on when they can give a notice to perform again for that part. So it has to be by the scheduled time that that house should close. Okay. All right. Let me reread that sentence. By the scheduled close of escrow date for the replacement property shall either close escrow, they can't if they haven't sold this one yet, or remove this contingency. So when that escrow date comes up, they need to remove that contingency. Because again, it said the ability to close escrow, not actually closing escrow. So if you have the buyer you need to be aware of when that house was supposed to close. They might close concurrently with this one needing to close first, and then you're just going to go with it and go through with it. But if you're really paying attention, you can ask them to remove that contingency, the second part of the contingency. Yeah.
Let's say that the contingency is removed. Is there any way to kind of, but the other property that they wanted to buy falls out? Is there any way for the seller to kind of save themselves?
Yeah, it'll explain that
Okay, great.
right later in the form. Okay, we're jump to number 2 now, time periods. So you might think, well, if they have 17 days to find a house or not, why would my buyer start all their inspections and get into that? Well, they don't. So the standard is that time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, and other obligations that commence from date of acceptance shall begin the day after seller delivers to buyer a written notice removing the finding replacement property contingency in paragraph 1A. Okay.
Right here, with the 17 days, let's just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
And those days don't start
Correct.
until the seller tells you they found a replacement property.
Exactly.
Before, you used to have to write that in.
So yes, but you might be thinking of the contingency of buyer's property because it is the opposite on that form. You have to check a box to delay the time periods on that, or this one, that's the standard. Okay, so you have the buyer. You're not going to do any of your inspections yet. I mean, they can if they really want to, but they don't have to yet. The contingency time periods do not start yet until the seller gives you the written removal of that contingency, and then the time frame starts.
A written removal that day 0.
Yes. Okay. You could check a box that states they remain as specified in the agreement to start right away, but the standard is to wait until they give you that first part of the contingency removal. If close of escrow is identified as a specific date in the agreement, it shall remain on that date. Okay, so a lot of times we put 30 days or 45 days. Some people will need it to close on a certain date. As long as that date is far enough out to give the seller time to find a replacement property, then that won't be an issue for having to extend. But so if you put 30 days, those 30 days don't start until they give you the contingency removal. If you put an actual date, that date stays the same. Okay, questions on that? No, I know this is thrilling. Okay, buyer's deposit. Buyer's deposit shall be delivered to escrow within 3 days after seller delivers to buyer a written notice removing the finding replacement property contingency as specified in 1A. Okay, again, so that's just stating they do not have to put their earnest money in until the seller has removed that first part of the contingency. Okay, or you can check a box and have them put it in right away. C, close of escrow. Parties agree that seller may extend the close of escrow date for the sale of seller's property for a maximum of blank additional days or until a date by providing buyer with written notice at the time seller removes the finding replacement property contingency specified in paragraph 1A. Okay, why would we need that? Well, they've are all the way to the 17th day, let's say, and they remove that because they finally get into contract, but it's a 45-day escrow and yours is a 30, then we need to allow some buffer in there. So if you could add it right now into that or wait and do an extension. People who use this form a lot, do you have any comments on that part? No?
We also add in like an SI that they can close on the house that the buyer's buying and then just have some days in possession to close their other. Gives them a little bit. It would actually be cool if they had something.
Yes.
Like that in this.
Yes.
Where, you know, hey, instead of closing from
Right.
a couple of days after closing.
For those on Zoom, she just said that sometimes they write in the other terms that they're including an SIP. That way this house can close and they can have a little bit of flexibility in there. That's a great idea.
I have had, since you're coming up to other terms, I have had a seller that said, when the buyer removes the contingencies on their other house, so they say in 17 days after buyer gets into escrow, they will remove this contingency.
Okay, that's actually really good.
They're gonna lose their deposit if they don't close, and that makes the buyer feel better that this is just gone. Or, you know, so.
Right. So they have them remove the close of the property at the contingency time. That's a good thing.
Full contingency at that 17, because they've removed their contingencies probably
Mm-hmm,
on the other property.
mm-hmm.
So now their deposit's at risk if they don't close, you know, but they could also ask for an extension. Like, hey,
Yeah.
we're extending this one, can you guys please give us more days because we're extending the contingency on this one because of well.
Okay, that's a good idea. So she's saying, yeah, in other terms, to clear up that section C, where it's talking about the close of the replacement property, and they ask that the close of replacement property contingency be removed once the seller removes the contingency on the property they are purchasing. So that's something to keep in mind. That cleans that up a little bit.
And I rewrite, and they always wrote the dates, the number of days, because otherwise the seller, they could say, well, they haven't removed. it.
Yeah,
And you
okay,
really are privy to their contract,
right.
you know, so they have to then prove it to you that they're not removing them, you know.
Okay.
Their case, the last one Barb and I just had on our buyer, we just made it contingent upon them finding a replacement, not even closing.
Mm-hmm.
And the seller, we sent this over with our offer, and the seller accepted it.
Yeah,
I don't think they noticed.
I've never been on the other side of Zoom before. Now I know what they're.
Oh.
So it's hard to hear you guys.
Yeah.
Questions, and I know the questions are very pertinent. So
yeah,
you know, maybe we should sit a little closer so we can hand the mic to each other.
okay.
It'll make more sense.
Yeah, I'm trying to repeat them, but it does get hard to hear what's going on.
Well, that's not from here on out, guys.
I'm not what I was saying.
Jessica, hey, Jen,
Yeah.
so I can write it down and say, like, what you would write in other terms.
Other terms?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
It's gotta be fast. Gotta pass that thing around.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So to restate, my question was, Jessica, could you re-say what that phrasing was for, the scenario that? I showed you?
yes. So and correct me if I'm wrong.
Whatever you want.
Okay. Yeah. Seller to remove the close of replacement property contingency 17 days after their offer is accepted on their replacement property.
Something.
Something like that. Basically, so you're not just leaving the close of replacement property part of the contingency out in the ether forever. It cleans it up a little bit.
Thank you.
And when you are the buyer, if you're paying attention enough to the MLS and talked with the listing agent and know that they need this form, you get to write in those other terms versus waiting for the listing agent to send you one because they're not going to put that in there.
And sometimes a phone call to the listing agent,
Yes.
because you could find out that they only need 5 days, they already have a house, or they are maybe already writing an offer, so.
Yes. Communication with the listing agent and the buyer agent is key. Find out as much as you can and work together. Sometimes you can't, but that's the ideal.
Well, and also communication to the seller, because I have one right now where it is contingent upon their, and it's a big house, it's $900,000. And the buyers they're keeping the contingency open the whole entire time. Because if their house falls, you know, they're not purchasing and they're coming from a long ways. I didn't
Right.
like that. I tried to counter them. I tried to get contingencies all within 17 days.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't do it. And my seller, I had to lay that out and say, you're gonna take your home off the market for 35 days. It can fall out at the last second and you will not have any money. You have to realize that. And they chose to do that. So,
This is the
Yeah,
seller's
we
replacement
have to-
property, though, you're probably talking about the buyer finding a replacement.
no, I'm talking about the seller. I'm talking about the seller having, you know, to lay that out there. And sometimes they choose to keep that contingency, you know. Yeah, I have one right now. It's contingent open the whole time for their house falling out.
That's how the form is designed.
Right.
Okay, so, and 3 here kind of goes into more explanation of why they have it written that way. Cancellation of replacement property. If seller's replacement property is in or enters escrow, or there is another agreement and either party to that escrow or agreement gives the other notice of cancellation, seller has 2 days thereafter to deliver to buyer written notice of that cancellation. Okay, that was a lot of wording. Basically, if the house the seller found to replace their house cancels, or let's say they're in contract on their new house, but it's contingent on another one, and that one falls out, which means really this one isn't going to work out, then the seller legally has to let their buyer know that it is canceled within 2 days. Okay? And then you decide what to do from there. It doesn't automatically cancel. You still have to go through things, but you can go back to the negotiating table and be like, am I going to give you another 17 days to find something else? Or are we done? The seller can back out at that point because they still have that close of replacement property contingency in place.
Have you ever heard? I made my stupid rule. You ever heard anybody like ask for per diem, like that's not a bank entity, ask for per diem?
Yep.
Yes,
Okay.
all the time.
Just wondering.
Can you explain?
Yeah, could you explain that to them?
Okay, so let's say some situation happens where they do need to go back and find another house, or some sticky situations happening with their replacement property and they need to extend for longer periods of time. There could come a time where the buyer would say, okay, seller, we're going to charge you a per diem, so a per day dollar amount, or it could be a flat fee up until a certain date. If you do not close by this date, you will owe us this amount of money.
$200 a day.
Yeah, or $50 a day, or $2,000 to extend it for 2 weeks, or whatever you negotiate. And it can go the opposite way too. If the buyer's taking forever to close, has nothing to do with this form, but if the buyer's taking forever to close, the seller can ask for a per diem as well.
Or the buyer just is requesting an extension for something. The
Yes.
seller, I've seen the seller say, I'll give it to you, but you're gonna pay me this much a day.
So if there was an extension, they could do the same thing.
I have one situation right now where.
Pass the
I
stick.
have a situation right now where my seller is already in contract for a house in Texas. I'm having a hard time selling their home. So the agent from Texas told the buyer, my seller, if you want to continue with the purchase, we will give you the extension, but you have to give us a $2,000 non-refundable. Is that called a deposit at that point? Because
No,
it's not.
Consideration.
yeah,
Consideration, yeah, okay. So now she put that on me. Sell my house. Reduce the price.
Reduce the price.
yeah,
So she's gonna call me today to tell me they want to do. Anyway, so-
yeah. Okay,
And every state is different. We're not allowed to do non-refundable.
So every state is different because our contract clearly states that you are not in any way, shape, or form allowed to say non-refundable deposit. I don't know what would happen if we
Yeah.
tried to call it a
you
consideration.
can call it something else.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
I think what extortion.
extortion.
That's extortion. An increased deposit, but this isn't.
no, it's not an increased deposit there. It's just a
And I would
a
say
per
before
diem or
we
whatever.
reach that, we talk to a broker,
Yeah.
make sure we're covering it clearly.
Okay. 4, removal of contingencies. Even after the expiration of the time for the finding replacement property contingency specified in paragraph 1A, seller retains the right to remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel the agreement until buyer cancels pursuant to paragraph 1A. Once buyer receives seller's written removal of the finding replacement property contingency, buyer may not cancel pursuant to 1A. Okay, what does that mean? Again, more words. That means if the 17 days comes and goes and the seller has not found a replacement property, that's not automatically removed, it's not automatically canceled. They still retain that right, just like in the purchase agreement when we have contingencies and the date comes up, it's not automatically removed, right? So in this case, the buyer would need to give the seller the notice to seller to perform to remove that contingency or cancel. Okay, so that's all that's saying. It's not automatic. Yes.
And when someone puts in the contract that contingencies are like automatically removed, that.
Doesn't mean
valid.
anything.
Yeah.
No.
Cause you
Yeah.
have to
Yep.
submit the paperwork. for it.
Yeah. I would love to just write, it's not valid or whatever, and then do my own contract, but it doesn't work that way. You can write, it's automatically removed. It's not automatically removed without the proper channels. Okay. Yeah, I've seen that. I always laugh like, oh yeah, big scary guy gonna tell me it's automatic. No, it's not. Sorry. Okay. Where was I? Buyer right to cancel, number 5. How can the buyer cancel during this time? Buyer may cancel the agreement in writing as follows. A, after first giving the seller a notice of seller to perform if seller fails to remove the finding replacement property contingency. Okay, so if the seller does not remove the finding replacement property within the 17 days or whatever amount of days you wrote in the top, they need to give a seller notice to perform. If that comes up and down and the seller does not cancel, the buyer can cancel for that reason. B, after first giving seller a notice of seller to perform, if the seller fails to give proof of replacement as specified in paragraph 1A. So remember, you have to do 2 things as the seller. You have to remove the contingency and you have to give proof that you're in contract or you have a lease agreement. Okay, so if you don't give that proof, the buyer can give you a notice to perform and they can cancel on you for not giving you proof. I think that would probably only happen if they really wanted to get out. But just give all the documentation and be in communication with the buyer agent. C, if paragraph 1C is checked, remember 1C is the close. After first giving seller a notice to seller to perform, if seller fails to remove the closing on replacement property contingency. D, if seller gives notice to buyer of either party's cancellation of the agreement for replacement property. So if their replacement property falls out, they give the notice, the buyer can cancel it right away. Note, if seller is unable to meet the obligations for other timeframes in the agreement, such as the close of escrow, buyer may cancel as permitted in the agreement, even if the contingency is not removed. 6, seller right to cancel. How can the seller cancel? Seller may cancel the agreement in writing as follows. A, if prior to seller's removal of the finding replacement property contingency, seller is unable to enter into a contract to acquire replacement property. Okay, they can't find one in those 17 days, they can cancel. Remember before, if you didn't have this form, the seller can't cancel unless the buyer messes up. B, if paragraph 1C is checked, seller is unable to close escrow on replacement property according to that contract. So if it falls out of contract on the house they're purchasing, they can cancel as long as 1C is checked and in place. Or C, buyer cost. This is what happens if they cancel. If seller cancels pursuant to paragraph 6A or B, so the 2 above, seller shall return any deposit, and 2, if checked, after delivering receipts to escrow holder, buyer shall be entitled to buyer's reasonable out-of-pocket expenses for inspection reports and appraisal fees under the agreement. Okay, so that's important. You need to check that if you're the buyer. You want to check it because that says if you get past the finding the replacement property, they removed that, they're going through, they still have the close of replacement property intact, and then that one falls out, your buyer has already done the inspections, they've done the appraisal, because they're acting on good faith that this is going to close, and it doesn't close, then they can charge the seller for those fees. But you need to check that box on section 6C. Okay, and then the last page is just the signing. So, questions, comments, Ashley? Yes.
I have one.
To share.
Okay.
Jessica? Oh,
Yep. Hang on,
Oh.
Brad.
I'll wait. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So we, the buyers wrote their offer, it happened to be in Easton, so it had a well and a septic. So they asked the seller to pay for the well and the septic. The agent was so good and got the well inspection done right away. Which we kind of liked. Because their well inspector said the well needed to be replaced. So now the buyers knew this way before the sellers got into escrow. So unfortunately, they were already negotiating like what was happening with the well during the time the sellers were getting into escrow. The sellers got into escrow. The buyers said, until we finish this negotiations, I'm not paying money for inspections because we will cancel. So it was nice. So while the contingencies start, we didn't write in there that the seller to provide the well in that, but for the contract, it says 7 days. But I'm not remembering if we read on there, does that mean the seller also, his 0 period doesn't start until they until they get into escrow on their replacement property? Because if it did, I would be writing, I'm gonna go back and read this again. But I would be writing now, seller to provide their day 0 for their giving the buyer their disclosures, that they have 7 days. That would start at acceptance versus at removal of the COP.
Mm-hmm.
Because that did save the buyer money on their inspections. So it did, it caused chaos, but we were fine with that. We were
Okay.
totally fine.
So your question is, when they remove that contingency and give you proof, is that day 0?
For the seller, like, I need to go back and read that. Because
It is day 0 for the buyers,
Yes.
but I guess.
But it doesn't necessarily have to be day 0 on their purchase. Yeah.
It's not day, that necessarily doesn't mean it's day 0 for the sellers to get all their stuff to the buyers
Right.
and inspections. Would make
Yes.
sense if it was. I'm gonna go back and read it.
Yeah, and I don't think let's read.
I'm like, I started thinking about that as I was saying this. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I need to go back and read again to see if it does cover the seller as well. In the day 0. Correct, but this changes the contract for day 0 for the buyer. Does it change day 0 for the seller? That's what I was thinking is, I don't think it does, but I'm like, now I got.
So are you thinking that maybe they got into contract on day 5 of the 17 they were allowed but didn't remove?
No, I'm thinking,
She's talking about delivery.
no, I'm just talking
Did the
about
seller
delivery
need
of
to get the
seller's
seller
documents.
For did the seller need to get us the well inspection that quickly? Because they were in contract on their replacement property, yeah. Did they need to do that, is what she's asking, like, did they have to?
I'm
do
not
all
even
the
asking,
disclosure?
I'm just saying this is what
Mhm.
happened, but I'm gonna go back and read that, I'm not asking a question at all. I'm
Okay.
just telling you what happened in our transaction, but then it made me, as I'm telling you what happened, I started
Mhm.
thinking. Could the seller have waited until they got in, they found their
Yes.
replacement property, and then
Okay,
day 7
gotcha.
started with their.
Yeah, I believe they can, because it does say that all time periods start when the buyer receives the removal of that
Right. So is it
contingency.
seller delivery of documents, is that also included in that?
Yeah, because
I
it
guess I
says
need to read the
all.
paragraph and see what
Yeah.
I interpret.
Yeah.
Because that would be a good thing if you had a well, because wells do take time sometimes to get it would be a good thing to also write in there under other terms, sellers, time periods for providing their inspections and that to start at acceptance of contract, you know,
Yeah.
because they do too.
Jessica,
Yes, Brad.
that is exactly, well, that topic is exactly what I wanted to talk about. We're referring right now to paragraph 2A, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I've always understood this. If you read carefully what the items are that they talk about, inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, I do not think that that should allow the seller to delay giving the buyer the disclosures such as the TDS, SPQ, all that other stuff. I think that should all be going to the buyer as soon as the offer is accepted. The reason I think for delay on doing inspections is certainly the buyer shouldn't have to spend any money inspecting a house when the seller hasn't at least gotten themselves into an escrow on a replacement property.
That's true.
But there's no reason in the world. I'm in an escrow right now, and I do not understand why agents don't do the following. When I take a listing, the day that I put that listing up, I've already gotten all my disclosures done. And so well, I shouldn't say by the time we list it, but let's put it this way. By the time I get an offer accepted, I'm able to send all of the disclosures out to the other agent or to the buyer immediately after that. Well, I'm in an escrow since Monday right now on a property, and I've asked a couple of times. I still haven't gotten the disclosures. We may have wanted to see those before we go ahead and spend money on our inspections that are scheduled for tomorrow. So I don't see any reason in the world that a seller shouldn't be providing disclosures to the buyer up front, because that's not something that's going to cost the seller anything, but it could influence the buyer to whether they want to stay in that deal or not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree with you, and I always prepare disclosures ahead of time. I mean, unless we're in a market where houses are sitting for 6 months, then you don't want to do that right away. But I mean, they legally have 7 days to get it to them, so
Right,
there's not much
right.
you can do about that.
Exactly. Now, going back to 2A, I think you used in your last comments that you were making, you used the word all. Well, I see specifically inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, and other obligations. I think they need to make a modification to that contract or to that addendum that would say this would not apply to the disclosures that seller is supposed to provide the buyer. Those should really be going out immediately after a contract signed, not waiting until the seller removes the contingency of finding replacement property.
Yeah, but I think you'd have to argue that with if you're on the buyer side, you're going to have to beg the listing agent for that, and it's just going to be an argument. So,
Well, but
yeah,
let me
I
tell
think
you
they
this.
do need to
I
have it
think
read.
I think in the seller's interest, it's not just the buyer's interest. I think in the seller's interest, they should be providing those early. Because what happens if the seller goes out, looks for replacement property, boom, they find their dream house, they get an escrow. Now they provide the buyer on their first property, the one they're selling, some disclosures, and the buyer has right of rescission on some of those things, and they back out. I think it's up to the agent to explain that to the seller. You need to get those things out right away. And
Yeah,
I don't know if there's any ambiguity in that 2A, but I think there needs to be it needs to be very clear that that those contingencies that we're talking about delaying should not include the seller's obligation to give the disclosures. Those things should be according to what the original contract says, whether it's 5 or 7 days, but not waiting until the seller gets in a replacement property escrow.
yeah, Barb.
I think there is the option for that to be a thing if you check the box where it says as specified in the contract.
Yeah, you could check the box. That would make everything start then.
That's not what you want. I don't think you want the buyer to be spending money on inspections yet. But there's no reason in the world that the seller shouldn't be providing to the buyer the disclosures that they're going to need to do anyway, because those aren't going to cost anyone anything. It's just a matter of getting those things out there.
In the contract that Ashley and I had with this particular property, it would have indeed cost the seller money because they had agreed to do well septic inspections on the property. And that would have indeed costed them, that's not a word.
That would be different.
Money in that
So
particular
probably wouldn't have to
case,
do
and
that.
anything in the contract that the seller has agreed to, because they can agree to other costs as well.
I think, Brad, you could write in other terms, if you're the buyer, that the seller is to deliver disclosures within 7 days of acceptance,
Yep.
if you want those ahead of time.
Yeah, I think that's a good solution. It's because it's not, I don't see it specifically provided any other way, but that really, that would solve the problem. And then what you could do is put in there under other terms that something such as a septic cert, or let's say a roof cert, if it was asked for in the contract, those things would be done after the seller removes that contingency. Anything that's going to cost the seller any money, I can see why you'd want to delay that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, any other questions or comments about this form?
Oh, I do have a comment. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay.
Question, so, do you get this filled out at the time of the offer or?
Yes.
So-
Yeah, so if you're on the buyer side, communication with the listing side that they need this, you fill it out to your buyer's benefit and send it with the offer. If that doesn't happen and you're the listing agent and you did not receive this in your offer, you're going to counter back and include it.
Okay, so you don't need to get it done like ahead of time, it's just once you get it.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So I don't know if you know this, but I'm kind of a control freak. So anything I know that if it's gonna benefit the seller, if the seller's agent fills it out, then I wanna fill it out for my buyer. So if I see that they're getting a replacement property, or when I call the agent and I ask, hey, where the seller's going? Are they getting a replacement property? Is this contingent upon them getting a replacement property? If they say yes, I'm filling that document out because I want it to benefit my fiduciaries to the buyer.
Right.
Not the seller.
Yeah.
So I'm filling anything out. If they want time in possession, I'm filling out the SIP. Because that way it's done the way I like it. And not maybe the crazy agent on the other side.
Right.
I'm the crazy agent on the buyer side, so I'm saying that lovingly. But yes, so that's exactly what I wanted to say to you, is just fill it out. If you're new, get them all and fill them out on your own, and just make sure you mark all the boxes correctly.
Get help if you need it. It's over here.
This has been known to happen. I've marked box before.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you have this form filled out and you get into escrow, the seller gives the buyer the disclosures within these 17 days, and the buyer doesn't like what they see on the SPQ and TDS. Can they cancel before the 17 days contingency that they're giving the seller?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're not stuck waiting for the time to start. They still have all their contingencies in place. Like if they lost their job and now within that 17 days and they can't get a loan, they can cancel for that reason.
I wanted.
Yeah.
If I was the listing
Right.
agent and the buyer said, oh, I see something I did not like, there was a death on the property, I'd rather them cancel while the seller still was looking than to get there, because now I have time to just get the seller, oh, they're looking now, and get a new buyer into the contract with the seller.
Yeah.
Sorry, you might want to repeat that. I don't have a microphone.
We need to pin one on you. All right. Anyone else? Nope. Okay, then that's the SPRP.
Great.
Woohoo.
Thank you, Jessica.
All
Great
right. See
job.
you next week. Thank you.
Yes, I know.
Woo.